Alright, hello everyone, my name is and I'm going to be presenting today on the resurrection of Jesus. Now, from current slide. So the importance of the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is arguably the most important event in Christian theology. So the idea is that Jesus, although he was a miracle worker, they weren't as big as the resurrection. That is to say, he was crucified, which was seen by many as a curse from God. So the resurrection was almost like this redeeming miracle that granted him divine status, the hope that he was vindicated and can reanimate our dead bodies alive during the end of times. And scholars recognize this because, without the resurrection of Jesus Christ, there would be no resurrection of the dead in the end of times. And if there's no resurrection of the dead in the end of times, well, there's no point in following Christianity. And as Paul says himself, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is in vain. 1 Corinthians 15:17. So, before we go on, I'd just like to present what is known as the historical method by many critical historians. The historical method is the method in which someone evaluates a historical hypothesis. So some of the guidelines you would want to follow are split into mainly two categories: source criticism and historical reasoning. Source criticism has to do with the actual sources, and historical reasoning has to do with your hypothesis. Ideally, you want your sources to be as close to first-hand accounts or eyewitness testimony. You will want these accounts to be independently corroborated. So, for example, if one guy's copying off of another guy, that's not corroboration. It's multiple sources, but they're not independent. Of course, they can't be fake. They have to be reliable and authentic. Basically, the idea between explanatory power is that the evidence explains the hypothesis, and vice versa, explanatory scope. Your current hypotheses explain the current evidence. It has to be plausible and compatible with the evidence. Now, what I mean by that is, it is disconfirmed by less facts. So, if you have a hypothesis that's on shaky grounds, then and it can easily be disproven by a bunch of hypotheticals that are not uncommon, then perhaps it's not the best hypothesis. And you don't want to add too many facts that you don't have evidence for. You don't want to be ad hoc, per se. That is to say, you don't want to add too many hypotheticals to your hypothesis. So, Gary Habermas is a critical historian who arose during the Beaumonian era of the historical Jesus studies, that is to say, back in the 1970s, and he did a dissertation on the resurrection of Jesus, on what he calls the minimal facts approach. And it builds a case for resurrection based off of historical facts granted by virtually all scholars on the subject, even the skeptical ones. That is to say that not everyone who studies the historical Jesus or early Christianity is necessarily a Christian. They just study things that are related to Christianity. And among these are Jesus was a rabbi who claimed to be the Messiah, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and was buried. Jesus' death caused the disciples to despair and lose hope. The disciples had experiences which they believed to be the physical risen Jesus. The disciples were transformed from afraid to identify themselves with the capital punishment to bold proclaimers of Jesus' death and resurrection, some having been martyred later on. The resurrected Messiah and God was the central message of the early church, and this message originated and was especially proclaimed around Jerusalem, the location of Jesus' death and burial, but also spread across the entire Mediterranean. Sunday, the day of Jesus' reported resurrection, became the primary day of worship, and among those who converted due to what they reported to be the risen Jesus were unbelievers and infamous enemies of Christianity, such as James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul. They saw the risen Jesus and immediately converted to Christianity. Now, all of these facts that I have listed over here are accepted by virtually all scholars, not just a majority. In the high 90s I'm talking about, the high 90%. Now, the empty tomb, it's more so in a 2/3 to 3/4 category in terms of the amount of scholars who accept it, but the scholars who don't, they don't believe that the tomb was full. They believe that there was no tomb to begin with. If you were a crucified victim, there was no point in giving you proper burial if the idea was to humiliate you. Nonetheless, in Jerusalem, they allowed for exceptions, and in the case of Jesus, there are many, and we can discuss this later on, there are many reasons to believe there was an empty tomb. It was reported by women who had lower status in the Mediterranean. It was a fact reported by the enemies of Christianity. One of the counter arguments against Christianity were that Jesus' disciples stole the body from the tomb, which implies that there was a tomb. So I've researched this a lot. I read so many papers, watched so many debates, I spoke to scholars myself, and we can go over the specific evidences for why we believe these to be true. But nonetheless, I would like to go over the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. Now, this creed is essentially a list of the appearances of Jesus and who he appeared to. And among this list are groups. You have foes and skeptics of Christianity. You have individual appearances. You have all sorts of appearances. And this is found in one of these 7 undisputed Pauline epistles. We're getting this information from someone who, from Paul, a persecutor of the church, who knew the original apostles, who knew virtually everyone in this list. The creedal affirmation, or at least its doctrines, are dated to 2 to 3 years after Jesus' death, a terminus postquem of 36 CE, or 39 if you put Jesus' death at 33. Some scholars would even date it to months or days after Jesus' crucifixion. In order to do this, you have to be really good in the Greek, the Koine Greek. I don't have my Koine Greek New Testament with me right now, but there are specific indicative hints that would lead us to believe that this is indeed a creedal affirmation. For what I received, I pass on to you as of first importance. Paradoka and paralibon, those are the Greek words which are used to pass on a rabbinical tradition. The syntactical structure is very rhythmic in nature, that Christ did this, and that this, and that this, and that this. And then there's multiple other reasons why to think this is a creedal affirmation. I must say, though, that I did not come from an Ivy League university, so just as a disclaimer, I am not a scholar, but I've researched this a lot, is what I'm trying to say. So the importance of this is not necessarily that we know that the creed came from 36 CE, although it is highly likely it came from 2 to 3 years after Jesus' death. But it's the idea that Paul is saying that I pass on to you what I received when I became a Christian. And Paul became a Christian 2 to 3 years after Jesus' death. When Paul became a Christian, these doctrines were already being circulated around. So it's not as if this was like a legend that grew over time, and we'll discuss the alternative naturalistic explanations, but what I'm trying to say over here is that this creedal affirmation establishes really early data for group appearances, individual appearances, appearances to skeptics and enemies of Christianity of the resurrected Christ. So the most popular theories in critical scholarship, according to Golder and the attestation of many critics, the number one hypothesis is actually the resurrection hypothesis. And you also get other scholars that say, I'm not a Christian, but Jesus for sure did miracles. I think that one was Richard Bauckham. The second most popular response is to take an agnostic sort of stance. We don't know, we can't know much about history. Third most popular response is to go the hallucination/delusion hypothesis. The disciples did not actually see the risen Jesus, but it was actually a hallucination, a mass hallucination in a group setting. In one case, in the appearance to the 500, complete delusion. And other hypotheses that we will go over but are not really taken seriously in modern scholarship anymore are the conspiracy hypothesis, the disciples lied about it, the swoon hypothesis that Jesus survived crucifixion, and legend/mysticism.